November 12, 1944. RAF Woodbridge, England. The air hung thick with a bone-chilling fog, reducing visibility to a mere 100 feet, barely enough to make out the nose of an aircraft. Out of this dense gray mist, a B-17 Flying Fortress, its fuselage scarred by shrapnel and its paint peeling in places, emerged like a spectral giant. The bomber's tail number, 42-31407, was barely legible through the haze. Inside, its vital systems were in shambles. Hydraulic lines lay severed, rendering all hydraulic functions useless. The landing gear hung precariously halfway extended, stuck fast by the failed hydraulics. And the number 4 engine, once a roaring powerhouse, now lay dormant, a useless hulk of twisted metal and charred wiring. In the cramped cockpit, First Lieutenant Thomas Crawford gripped the control yoke so tightly his knuckles whitened, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the runway lights ahead. He was staring down a decision that defied every protocol, every lesson, and every instinct drilled into him during years of flight training. Land the massive bomber backwards, tail first, or watch the 8 men who trusted him with their lives perish in a fiery crash. The crackle of the radio cut through the tense silence in the cockpit, the control tower's voice sharp with panic and urgency. "Crawford, negative. Abort the approach immediately. Abort." The urgency in the controller's tone was palpable, a desperate plea born from years of witnessing the deadly consequences of risky maneuvers. But Crawford's response was steady, flat, and unyielding, each word measured and sure. "Tower, I'm out of options. The wheels won't lock into place. Any normal landing will be catastrophic. I'm coming in tail first." A stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the sputter of the remaining 3 engines. Then the controller's disbelieving shout erupted over the radio. "Crawford, you're insane. That maneuver will make the bomber cartwheel. You'll all die." Crawford's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Maybe, but if I don't try, we're guaranteed dead. This way, my crew has a shot to walk away." With that, he ignored the continued protests from the tower and began the painstaking process of preparing for the unthinkable. A full reverse approach, flying the bomber backwards into the fog. What unfolded over the next 4 minutes would rewrite emergency landing procedures for every Allied Air Force. It began with the riskiest call a pilot could make, ignoring every instinct, every manual, every regulation to fly backwards into the fog. This is the story of how laughter turned to silence, how 8 men condemned to death survived, and how one pilot's impossible maneuver ascended to legend. Thomas Crawford's love for flying was forged in the wide-open skies of Montana, where winter fog rolled through the mountain valleys like slow-moving ocean swells, obscuring the terrain and testing the skill of even the most experienced pilots. His father, a grizzled crop duster with hands calloused from years of gripping a control yoke, taught him the fundamentals of flying not from manuals, but from hard-earned experience. Stay low to the ground, read the land by feel rather than just instruments, and trust your gut when the world around you turns gray. Crawford absorbed these lessons like a sponge, inheriting his father's sharp intuition and unshakable calm under pressure. By the age of 22, he'd logged over 800 flight hours, mastering everything from small prop planes to larger cargo aircraft. By 24, he was one of the youngest pilots in the 8th Air Force, entrusted with piloting the iconic B-17 Flying Fortress on dangerous bombing runs deep into Nazi-occupied Germany. His crew, a tight-knit group of men who'd survived dozens of missions together, nicknamed him Backwards Tom, a moniker that had nothing to do with his flying and everything to do with his eccentric poker style. Crawford was a master of defying expectations at the card table. He bet against the odds, folded strong hands when everyone expected him to raise, and raised on weak ones to throw his opponents off balance. He had a knack for reading people, not by what they said or did, but by the subtle, unspoken tells that revealed their true intentions. Once, his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Mike Jennings, asked him why he played so unpredictably. Crawford's reply became crew lore. "In poker and flying, everyone expects you to play forward, but sometimes the winning move is the one nobody sees coming." November 12th started as a routine mission. A pre-dawn briefing set their target, the Merburg oil refineries deep in Germany. 82 B-17s, escorted by 3,000 fighters, would make up the strike force. Crawford's 9-man crew had already flown 27 missions together, just 3 more to complete their tour and head home. They'd grown cautious, the kind of caution that keeps you alive when statistics say you're already dead. Takeoff was at precisely 0547 hours. The sky still dark with the last traces of night as the B-17's engines roared to life, shaking the tarmac beneath them. Formation assembly over the cold, choppy waters of the North Sea went off without a hitch, with Crawford's fortress, christened Rocky Mountain High in honor of his Montana roots, sliding smoothly into its assigned position in the high squadron. Every step of the mission followed the playbook to the letter, a testament to the crew's discipline and experience. Jennings, the co-pilot, handled the complex radio systems with practiced ease, his fingers dancing over the dials to maintain contact with the formation and base. Navigator Lieutenant Dan Morrison hunched over his maps and navigational instruments, plotting the precise waypoints that would guide them to their target and back. Engineer Sergeant Frank Delgado stood vigilant at his station, monitoring fuel flow, engine temperatures, and a dozen other vital metrics that could mean the difference between life and death. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Eddie Kowalski squeezed himself into the tiny, spherical glass bubble beneath the aircraft, his body contorted to fit in the cramped space, his eyes scanning the skies below for any sign of enemy fighters. Waist gunners Sergeants Tommy Lou and Carl Henderson took up positions at the side windows, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers of their .50 caliber machine guns, while tail gunner Sergeant Marcus Washington crouched in the rear compartment, his back pressed against the cold metal wall as he kept watch over the bomber's most vulnerable spot. Radio operator Sergeant Bill Ali tracked dozens of frequencies, listening for updates from command and warnings of enemy activity, and Bombardier Lieutenant James Sterling meticulously calibrated the Norden bomb sight, the most advanced targeting system of its time, ensuring that their payload would hit the mark. 8 men plus Crawford, bound together by trust in the shared understanding of the danger they faced. They trusted him implicitly not just because of his skill as a pilot, but because he never panicked, not when flak burst so close the aircraft shook, not when enemy fighters dove through the formation like angry hornets. Crawford flew with a calm, deliberate focus, his movements smooth and precise, as if he were following a map only he could see, guiding them safely through the chaos of war. The formation crossed into Germany at 14,000 feet, with a solid layer of cloud cover below. Intelligence reports had predicted light resistance. They were wrong. At 0847 hours, 50 miles from the target, the relative calm of the mission shattered in an instant. The sky erupted in a storm of fire and metal as dozens of Messerschmitt B F-109S, their silver fuselages glinting in the sunlight, dove through the bomber stream in perfectly coordinated waves, their cannon fire stitching across the formations like deadly threads, tearing through aluminum fuselages and igniting fuel tanks. One by one, B-17s fell from the sky, engulfed in flames, their crews bailing out if they were lucky, or going down with the aircraft if they weren't. Crawford's squadron took its first hit at 0851 hours. The bomber directly ahead of them exploded in a brilliant ball of fire, its wreckage spinning wildly into the slipstream, pieces of metal and debris flying in all directions. Crawford reacted instantly, yanking the control yoke hard to the right, the B-17 banking sharply as he avoided the debris by a mere 30 feet, so close that the crew could feel the heat from the burning wreckage on their faces. Then the flak started, black puffs of smoke blooming across the sky like toxic flowers, each one hiding a shower of shrapnel that could tear the aircraft apart. The fortress shuddered violently as shrapnel struck its fuselage, the sound of metal screaming against metal echoing through the cabin. Kowalski, trapped in his ball turret, could see the flak bursting all around him, the world outside turning into a chaotic blur of smoke and fire. Kowalski's voice crackled over the intercom. "German fighters at 6 o'clock. Washington opened fire from the tail, his twin .50 caliber machine guns hammering away. Tracer rounds arced through the formation. A Focke-Wulf 190 rolled inverted and dove straight for them. Lou fired from the waist gun, walking his rounds across the fighter's wing. The FW-190 exploded, tumbling toward the earth in a ball of fire. But two more took its place. Crawford pushed the yoke forward, dropping 500 feet in 3 seconds. The maneuver slammed the crew against their restraints, but shattered the German attack geometry. The fighters overshot, climbing away to reposition. "Good flying, Skipper," Jennings said quietly. Crawford didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the formation ahead, counting the missing aircraft. They'd lost 4 bombers in 2 minutes. The mission was unraveling. At 0912 hours, they reached the initial point, the moment to turn toward the bomb run. Morrison called out headings and Sterling activated the Norden bomb site. The bomber steadied on course, Crawford's hands light on the controls. In bombing formation, pilots flew straight and level. No evasive action allowed. The bombardier was in command now. As they approached the target, the flak intensified to a deafening crescendo, shells bursting at exactly their altitude, as if the German gunners had a direct line to their coordinates. Shrapnel ripped through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, creating a hailstorm of metal inside the cabin. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous, thunderous roar that drowned out even the sound of the engines, making it impossible to hear anything without shouting. Crawford felt the impacts reverberate through the airframe, each jolt a reminder of how fragile their aircraft was. At first, the hits were small, manageable, superficial damage to the wings and fuselage. But then, without warning, a large caliber shell detonated directly beneath the bomber. The force of the explosion lifting the aircraft several feet off its flight path as if it were a toy. The crew was thrown forward in their seats, their safety harnesses digging into their shoulders as they struggled to maintain their positions. The fortress lurched upward, thrown violently by the force of the blast, before slamming back down into the air. Shrapnel tore through the bomb bay with devastating effect, severing the critical hydraulic lines that powered the landing gear, brakes, and flaps. Red hydraulic fluid sprayed across the catwalk and the bomb bay floor, glistening in the dim light like blood. Delgado, the engineer, was the first to spot the disaster, his eyes widening as he watched the fluid gush from the broken lines. He scrambled to his feet, nearly slipping on the slick surface, and shouted over the intercom, his voice urgent and panicked. "Hydraulics failing! Pressure dropping fast! We're losing it all!" His words sent a chill through the crew, each man knowing exactly what a loss of hydraulics meant in the middle of a mission deep behind enemy lines. Crawford checked his gauges. Hydraulic pressure, 0. That meant no brakes, no reliable landing gear extension, no flaps. The gear might drop from gravity alone, but it would never lock. And without locked gear, a normal landing would mean cartwheeling down the runway at 120 knots. Certain death for everyone on board. "Bombs away!" Sterling's voice cut through the chaos. The fortress lightened as 4,000 pounds of ordnance fell toward the refinery below. Crawford banked left, rejoining the formation, but the hits kept coming. At 0924 hours, the number 4 engine took a direct flak strike, disintegrating in a cloud of metal fragments and burning oil. Crawford feathered the propeller, stopping its useless rotation. Now they were down to 3 engines, barely flyable, but still airborne. At 0931 hours, over the German border, a burst of cannon fire from a pursuing Bf-109 raked the right wing. Fuel gushed from punctured tanks. Alley frantically transferred fuel to the left side tanks, trying to balance the load, but they were losing aviation gasoline at 20 gallons per minute. Jennings did the math quickly. "Skipper, we won't make England." Crawford already knew. The question was where to ditch: open water, enemy-occupied territory, or risk a final approach to an English emergency airfield with no hydraulics, minimal fuel, and fog so thick you couldn't see the ground. At 10:47 hours, after what felt like an eternity of flying on the edge of disaster, they crossed the English Channel, the faint outline of England visible through the fog on the horizon. But any sense of relief was short-lived, as visibility had collapsed entirely. Thick, dense fog rolled across the coast in impenetrable gray walls, turning the world into a featureless void. Crawford knew he had to descend, but he also knew that flying through such thick fog without visual references was a death sentence if he made a single mistake. He relied entirely on his instruments, his eyes glued to the dials and gauges that told him his altitude, speed, and heading. The crew fell silent, each man holding his breath as the bomber descended through the clouds, the only sound the hum of the remaining engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. At 5,000 feet, they broke into clear air for exactly 12 seconds, a brief glimpse of the green English countryside below, before the fog swallowed them again, plunging them back into the gray void. Woodbridge Tower, this is Rocky Mountain High. Declaring emergency, hydraulics gone, landing gear unstable, visibility 0, request immediate clearance. The tower controller's voice came back tense. Rocky Mountain, divert to Manston. Better visibility there. Negative tower, fuel critical, one approach only, request foam on runway. Copy that, foam trucks deploying, wind is calm, visibility 100 feet. You're cleared for emergency approach, runway 27. Crawford descended to 800 feet, the fog so thick he could barely see the tip of the wing. There was no horizon, no ground reference, nothing but an endless expanse of gray that disoriented his senses and tested his resolve. He relied on the instinct honed during years of flying in Montana's winter fog, trusting his instruments and his gut to guide him. At 400 feet, Jennings, the co-pilot, let out a small gasp, pointing ahead. "Skipper, I see the runway lights." Through the mist, faint orange glows were visible, barely brighter than fireflies, but they were enough to give them a target. Crawford adjusted his course, inching the bomber closer to the lights, his hands steady on the yoke despite the chaos in his mind. Then, without warning, the landing gear warning horn blared, a high-pitched, shrill sound that cut through the tension in the cockpit. The noise was a stark reminder of their predicament, a warning that their already dire situation was about to get worse. The main wheels had dropped from gravity, but the indicator lights stayed red. Unsafe, not locked. Delgado confirmed the worst. It'll collapse on touchdown. Crawford's mind raced through the options. A belly landing was possible, but the bomber would slide a quarter mile, likely cartwheeling. Bailing out in this fog meant half the crew would never find the ground in time. Trying to land on the unlocked gear would see the wheels fold, sending them tumbling at 100 knots. Then he remembered Montana, winter fog, his father's crop duster, and an impossible maneuver he'd watched as a boy. "Tower, I'm going to try something." "Go ahead, Rocky Mountain." Crawford's voice remained steady, as if he were ordering a meal. "I'm reversing approach. Coming in tail first." Silence, then the controller's shocked reply. "Say again, Rocky Mountain." "Tail first approach. I'll fly backwards. Touchdown on the tail wheel first. Let the nose settle. Main gear hits last. Minimal impact. Less chance of collapse." "Crawford, that's insane. You'll cartwheel." "Maybe, but it's our only shot." He didn't wait for the tower's approval. There was no time to waste. At 200 feet, Crawford pulled back gently on the throttle, reducing power and slowing the bomber to 90 knots, a speed that felt dangerously slow for such a large aircraft. The B-17 wallowed in the air, its controls feeling mushy and unresponsive, as if it were fighting against him every step of the way. He took a deep breath, centering himself, then nudged the rudder slightly to the left, causing the aircraft to slide sideways. The tail swung around slowly, ponderously, until it was pointing directly toward the runway. The nose angled 30 degrees off course, a position that felt completely unnatural to every fiber of his being. The bomber's wings tilted slightly, and for a moment it seemed as if it might stall, but Crawford made a tiny adjustment to the throttle, stabilizing the aircraft. The crew, sensing the maneuver, fell silent, their hearts pounding in their chests as they trusted their pilot to see them through. "Everybody brace," Crawford's voice cut through the intercom. "We're landing backwards." The crew didn't question him. They'd followed Crawford through hell 27 times before. If he said fly backwards, they'd fly backwards. Washington, in the tail turret, had the best view. "Skipper, I can see the approach lights. We're drifting left." Crawford corrected with a touch of rudder. The bomber slid sideways through the fog, tail leading, nose pointed into clean air. A maneuver that violated every law of aerodynamics. But Crawford wasn't flying by aerodynamics anymore. He was flying by physics. At 100 feet, the tailwheel touched the foam-covered runway, the contact so gentle it was barely more than a bump. Crawford held the yoke perfectly neutral, resisting the urge to overcorrect, letting gravity do its work as the aircraft settled onto the runway. The fuselage lowered slowly, tail first, the bottom of the bomber skidding through the foam like a sled on fresh snow, creating a trail of white behind it. The friction of the foam against the fuselage slowed them steadily, the speed dropping from 90 knots to 30, then 20 as the bomber slid forward. The crew braced themselves for the worst, expecting the main gear to collapse at any moment. But then the nose dropped, and the main wheels hit the runway with a hard thud, so hard that the aircraft bounced slightly before catching hold. The gear flexed and groaned under the strain, the metal creaking as if it were about to give way, but it held. The bomber rolled forward another 200 feet, the engines idling softly before coming to a complete stop. The fog swirled around them, hiding the aircraft from view of the tower and the emergency crews waiting nearby. Silence. Nothing but the idle of the remaining engines and the hiss of foam settling around the aircraft. Jennings stared at Crawford, disbelief in his eyes. "You just landed a B-17 backwards." Crawford killed the engines. "Yeah, let's not do that again." The tower controller's voice came through, shaking with emotion. "Rocky Mountain High, you are down. Emergency crews on the way. That was, I don't even have words for that." Crawford unstrapped himself, his hands as steady as ever. "Tower, we're shutting down. Crew walking out." And they did. All 9 men, alive and mostly unharmed. Crawford was the first to unstrap himself, his legs shaky from the adrenaline, but his hands still steady, and climbed down from the cockpit. Jennings followed close behind, then the rest of the crew, each man emerging from the bomber into the cold, foggy air, their bodies still trembling from the ordeal. They stood in a circle on the foam-covered runway, staring at their bomber, which sat tail first on the tarmac, its nose pointing skyward at a 20-degree angle, as if defying the laws of physics. The main gear was bent but unbroken, foam coating every surface of the aircraft, making it look like a giant, white-covered toy. Delgado, the engineer, let out a nervous chuckle, the tension of the past hours spilling out in laughter. It started as a small, shaky sound, but quickly escalated into uncontrollable, tears streaming down his face laughter. Lou joined in next, then Henderson, and soon the entire crew was laughing in the fog, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and pure joy at being alive when they should have been dead. The sound of their laughter cut through the fog, a stark contrast to the silence that had preceded their landing. Emergency crews arrived moments later, their vehicles' sirens wailing as they cut through the fog. Fire trucks, ambulances, and jeeps filled with ground personnel surrounded the bomber, their lights piercing the gray mist. The crew members of these emergency teams stared at the B-17 in awe and disbelief, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of the bomber sitting tail first on the runway. They stared at the long skid marks in the foam, at the bent but intact landing gear, and at Crawford, who stood calm and quiet off to the side, as if he'd just parked a car in a grocery store lot, rather than performing an impossible landing. Base Commander Colonel Richard Hayes pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers, his uniform crisp and his face serious as he approached the scene. He looked first at the bomber, then at Crawford, then back at the bomber, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief to something approaching admiration. "Lieutenant," he said, "did you just land tail first?" "Yes, sir." "That's impossible." "Apparently not, sir." Hayes studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You just rewrote the manual, Crawford. I don't know whether to court-martial you or give you a medal." Crawford's expression remained neutral. "I'll take the medal, sir." Laughter erupted again, this time from everyone. Ground crew, fire teams, medics. They'd all heard the radio traffic, all expected to find wreckage and bodies. Instead, they found a bomber parked backwards on the runway and 9 men walking away unscathed. Word spread through the barracks that night. Crawford had done the impossible, flown backwards, landed tail first, and saved 8 lives with a maneuver no one thought could work. The crew that had nicknamed him Backwards Tom for his poker strategy now used the name for something far greater, the pilot who bet on reverse odds and won. But the story didn't end there. What Crawford did that foggy day changed how pilots thought about emergencies, challenging the assumption that there was only one right way to land an aircraft. In the months that followed, 3 more pilots successfully used his technique to save their crews when hydraulics failed. The maneuver was named the Crawford Reversal, added to emergency procedure manuals, taught in training schools and studied by engineers eager to understand its physics. 3 days later, photographs of the incredible landing appeared in Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the U.S. military. Crawford standing beside his backwards parked bomber, his uniform unkempt, but his posture straight. The crew grinning like they'd just pulled off the greatest heist of their lives, their faces a mix of pride and relief. The headline read, "Pilot lands tail first, saves 9." But the most important photo of all never made the papers. It was taken by an engineering officer, Captain Henry Morrison of Wright Field's Engineering Division, who'd been dispatched to Woodbridge to examine the wreckage of the B-17. Morrison arrived expecting to find a smoldering pile of metal and bodies. Instead, he found a bomber sitting at an impossible angle, its crew alive and well. Intrigued, he spent hours measuring every detail: the length and angle of the skid marks in the foam, the exact angle of the aircraft's approach, the stress fractures in the landing gear struts, and the damage to the fuselage. He interviewed Crawford for 3 hours, asking detailed questions about every decision the pilot had made, every adjustment he'd made to the controls, and every thought that had gone through his mind during the landing. After compiling all his data, Morrison made an unusual and controversial recommendation. The maneuver should be formally studied, tested in controlled conditions, and potentially added to official emergency procedures for the entire Army Air Forces. Morrison's report sparked an immediate uproar at 8th Air Force headquarters, where generals and high-ranking officers were uncomfortable with the idea of pilots inventing unapproved procedures on the fly. To them, discipline and adherence to protocol were the foundation of military success, and Crawford's maneuver was seen as a reckless deviation from the rules that could encourage other pilots to take unnecessary risks. But Morrison's findings were irrefutable, backed by detailed calculations and physical evidence. He'd broken down the physics of the landing in painstaking detail. A normal B-17 landing on damaged, unlocked gear saw the main wheels hit the runway first, carrying the full weight of the 30-ton aircraft at 120 knots. The impact force of such a landing far exceeded the structural limits of the landing gear, almost guaranteeing that the gear would collapse, sending the bomber cartwheeling down the runway in a fiery crash. Crawford's reversal, however, distributed the impact force in a completely different way. The tail wheel, which carried only a small fraction of the aircraft's weight, touched down first, creating friction that slowed the bomber as the fuselage settled tail to nose. By the time the main gear hit the runway, the aircraft's speed had dropped to 60 knots, cutting the impact force in half. This reduced force was just enough to keep the damaged gear from collapsing. It was simple physics, brilliantly applied in a moment of crisis. Morrison's report was sent to every bomber group in the European theater. Most commanders ignored it, deeming it too unconventional. But 3 groups, the 91st, 305th, and 381st, added it to informal training. Pilots practiced the maneuver at high altitude, simulating approaches, learning its feel. On December 23, 1944, 6 weeks after Crawford's landing, a B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group lost hydraulics over Belgium. Pilot First Lieutenant David Chen had read Morrison's report and practiced the maneuver twice at 15,000 feet. Faced with the same choice as Crawford, he chose the reversal, landing tail first at RAF Bassingbourn. 8 men walked away. On January 17, 1945, another B-17 suffered hydraulic failure over France. Lieutenant Marcus Reed used the Crawford reversal at RAF Molesworth, saving 10 lives. On February 8, 1945, Lieutenant Thomas Yamaguchi repeated the feat, saving 9 more. 3 successful attempts in 3 months. Proof the maneuver wasn't luck, but replicable, teachable, and life-saving. In March 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces officially designated it Emergency Landing Procedure 7B, tail-first approach for hydraulic failure scenarios. The manual included Crawford's photograph, Morrison's calculations, and step-by-step instructions. Pilots called it the Crawford Reversal, engineers called it distributed impact landing. But everyone agreed it worked. Crawford finished his tour after 30 missions, rotating home to Montana in January 1945. The Army assigned him to training duty at Randolph Field, Texas, wanting him to teach the reversal to new pilots. But he refused. "I'm not qualified to teach something I only did once," he told his commander. "Get an instructor pilot who's practiced it." The Army brought in Captain James Holland, a test pilot who flew 40 tail-first landings under controlled conditions, refining the technique and establishing safe parameters. Minimum altitude 500 feet, maximum wind 15 knots, approach speed 90 knots, rate of descent 300 feet per minute. Holland taught 20 instructors, who in turn trained 300 pilots. By war's end, an estimated 1,500 Allied pilots knew the Crawford Reversal. 7 more used it in combat, saving 63 lives. The maneuver's impact extended beyond the war. In 1947, civilian aviation authorities studied it for commercial use, finding promise for gear malfunctions and low visibility, but civilian pilots resisted, fearing it would panic passengers. The technique remained a military tool for extreme emergencies. Crawford's crews stayed close after the war, all 9 surviving to hold reunions every 5 years at Crawford's Montana ranch near Billings. The last reunion was in 1993, with 6 men in attendance. Crawford, 81 at the time, still flew a Cessna 172 he'd bought in 1968. When Jennings asked if he'd ever practice the reversal again for old times, Crawford shook his head. "Once was enough. Lightning doesn't strike twice." The Rocky Mountain High never flew again. The stress of the tail-first landing had damaged the aircraft's airframe beyond repair, the metal weakened by the impact and the subsequent skid. The Army salvaged what usable parts they could, engines, radios, navigational equipment, and scrapped the rest, melting down the damaged fuselage for raw materials. But the bomber's iconic nose art was carefully preserved, a vibrant painting of Montana's snow-capped mountains, with wispy clouds floating below, a tribute to Crawford's hometown. Today, that nose art is on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, mounted on a section of the fuselage, with a detailed placard beneath it that tells the story of Crawford's impossible landing. Visitors to the museum pause in front of it, reading the story with wide eyes, and invariably ask the same question, their voices filled with disbelief. "He really landed tail first." Yes, he really did. Crawford died in 2001 at the age of 89, succumbing to heart failure in his sleep at his ranch in Montana. His death was quiet and peaceful, just like the man himself. His funeral was small and intimate, family members, a handful of old friends from his childhood and military days, and 3 surviving members of his B-17 crew. He'd refused any military honors, telling his family years earlier that he didn't deserve them. "I was just doing my job," he'd say whenever anyone called him a hero, brushing off the praise with a wave of his hand. But his obituary in the Billings Gazette, Montana's largest newspaper, told the truth about his courage and innovation. It described a pilot who'd ignored protocol to save his crew, who'd bet on reverse odds because he knew that the winning move is often the one no one else sees, and who'd proved that true innovation doesn't require permission. It requires courage. The obituary ended with a quote from Jennings, his longtime co-pilot and friend. "Tom taught me that rules exist to guide us, but they don't exist to chain us. When you're out of options, when following the rules means certain death, you make new ones. That's not recklessness, that's survival." That's what Tom did for us that day. The Crawford Reversal is still taught in military flight schools today. Modern aircraft have redundant hydraulic systems, making gear failure rare, but the principle endures. When conventional approaches fail, unconventional solutions save lives. Pilots learn the physics, practice in simulators, and hear the story of the Montana crop duster's son who flew backwards into legend. November 12, 1944, a day that began with laughter and camaraderie among the crew, turned to silence and terror as the bomber was damaged and the odds stacked against them, and ended with joy and relief as 8 condemned men walked away alive. It was the day one pilot proved that the impossible is just the probable that no one has tried yet. In warfare, as in life, survival often depends on thinking differently, on breaking free from the constraints of conventional wisdom, and seeing possibilities where others see only dead ends. Crawford understood that instinctively, his entire approach to flying and life shaped by his Montana upbringing and his love of poker. His poker strategy, betting against the odds, reading opponents' unspoken tells, reflected his flying philosophy: don't do what everyone expects you to do. Do what works. His crop duster upbringing taught him to trust his gut and read the terrain by feel, skills that proved invaluable in the fog over Woodbridge. And his intimate knowledge of the B-17, gained through hundreds of hours of flying, gave him the confidence to attempt a maneuver that no other pilot would have dared. All of these elements came together in that foggy moment to produce a breakthrough that would save dozens of lives. Military innovation often emerges from desperation, when standard procedures fail and individuals improvise. Most improvisations fail spectacularly. Crawford succeeded because he didn't just follow rules, he mastered the principles behind them. He didn't ask, how do I land normally with damaged gear? He asked, how do I minimize impact forces, no matter the orientation? That reframing was the key to his success. Crawford's legacy extends beyond aviation. Business schools use his story to teach creative problem-solving, framing it as backwards thinking, innovation under constraints. The 8 men he saved carried his lesson into civilian life, approaching obstacles by seeking unconventional solutions. None became famous, but all succeeded, crediting that foggy November day with teaching them resilience in adaptive thinking. The men who flew these World War II missions understood sacrifice in ways most of us never will. They improvised, adapted, and survived because they refused to accept that impossible meant certain death. Crawford's legacy lives on not just in emergency procedures, but in the understanding that innovation saves lives. If this story moved you, please click the like button. It helps YouTube recommend these untold World War II stories to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to our channel to never miss another account of courage, ingenuity, and the human spirit under fire. Hit the notification bell so you're alerted to our next video. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did you or someone you know serve in World War II? Share your memories below. Every comment helps preserve these stories for future generations. Next time, we'll tell you about the navigator who saved an entire bomber group using nothing but a broken compass and dead reckoning. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories must never be forgotten.